So in section 2.1, we said that elements can be classified as being either composed of individual atoms or being composed of homoatomic molecules. In this section, we're going to kind of look at some other ways that we can classify elements into different categories, and we're going to introduce the concept of the periodic table. We're going to keep talking about the periodic table for the next couple of sections. So this is a periodic table, and you're probably familiar with this from some other science class, and it's color-coded according to the types of elements that are present in the periodic table. And we've got here three different types of elements that we've identified: metals, semi-metals, and non-metals. And when you look at this, what you'll see is that all of the metals are on the left of the periodic table. All right, there they are. And in the little block that's underneath the periodic table, and I'm not going to add them all up now, but about 2/3 of the elements, just eyeballing it, are metals, right? So most of the elements on the periodic table are metals, and the metals are all on the left of the periodic table. Now, in this sort of yellowish color, we have all of the non-metals, the elements that are color-coded here as being non-metals. And what you see is that the non-metals are in this sort of little triangle that is over on the right of the periodic table, and there's not as many of them as there are metals, and they're separated from the metals by these green elements, which are color-coded as being semi-metals. So I do want to just point out here that sometimes the semi-metals are referred to as metalloids, and people will use those terms interchangeably. Now, you'll also note that our periodic table has some numbers across the top here, and these identify columns in the periodic table or groups in the periodic table. So columns are referred to as being groups by chemists, and you can see that there's two different ways that the groups have been labeled. We're going to come back to that labeling system in a moment. So what are the characteristics of metals? Well, all of the metals are solids at room temperature except for mercury, which is a liquid. So you now know the physical state of most of the elements on the periodic table. They're solids at room temperature. Not surprisingly, metals have the characteristic that they're shiny. Now, we have a fancier way of saying that. We say that the metals have what we call a metallic luster. Metals are good conductors of electricity, and they're also good conductors of heat. That's why we make, cookware out of metals, and why we make cabling for conducting electricity out of metals. We don't kind of go like, oh, we're going to make some, plastic cookware, because that's not really going to work. We don't make our electrical cables out of, oxygen gas, because that's not going to work, right? We make those things out of metals. Metals have this property that you can stretch them out into very thin wires without breaking, and a more fancy way of saying that is to say that metals are ductile. So we talked about an STM, scanning tunneling microscope tip, as being a good tip if it has just one atom on the end. So these tips also need to conduct electricity. So you guessed it, we're going to use metals for that. And all we're going to do is take a piece of wire and keep stretching it until it breaks. And in that manner, you can get one atom on the end of an STM tip, which is kind of cool. Metals also have this characteristic that you can press and beat and bend them into complex shapes, and they won't break. You can do this, in a really extreme sense, and later on we'll see that it's possible to get a foil of gold, which is one of the most famous metals, that's just a few atoms thick. So it's literally just like one or two atoms thick, which is pretty impressive. So when you see some really thin gold foil, it might just be a couple of atoms thick. So this characteristic of being able to be pressed and bent into complex shapes is referred to by scientists as the material being malleable. Okay, so as we mentioned before, the nonmetals are sort of this upper right corner of the periodic table, but the nonmetals also include hydrogen, which is commonly placed on the left of the periodic table, just to be a little bit confusing. So what you'll see is hydrogen over here, and then all of the rest of the nonmetals are over on the right of the periodic table. So nonmetals are normally quite dull, they're not shiny at all, and if they are a solid at room temperature, they tend to be brittle. So a classic example of that would be iodine. It's just kind of like a crystalline, purplish powdery material. Phosphorus and sulfur and selenium are solids at room temperature. Carbon's a solid at room temperature. They just tend to be kind of like brittle, easily broken materials, and you can kind of tell they don't have that metallic luster about them. We describe them as being dull. Most of them are poor conductors of heat and electricity. I got to say that one exception to that is that carbon is a good conductor of electricity. But there's always exceptions in chemistry. But in general, nonmetals have these properties, right? Now, most are solids or gases at room temperature. So let's just have a look at what we've got here, and I'll point out what ones are solids and what ones are gases. So carbon's a solid at room temperature. Phosphorus, sulfur, selenium, and iodine are all solids. Okay, so let's just put circle solids. And then I'm going to put crosses through the ones that are gases. So helium, neon, argon, krypton, xenon, and radon are all gases, as is nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, and chlorine. And then that makes it easy. There's only one nonmetal that is a liquid at room temperature, and that is bromine. So it's pretty, if you ever get asked in a trivia contest or something, what elements are liquids at room temperature, there is only two, mercury and bromine. And bromine, remember, is a diatomic. Okay. So it's not that hard. If you wanted to you don't have to. You could just note it on your periodic table to memorize the physical state of all 118 elements. And the reason why it's so easy is because most of them are solids. Only two of them are gases. So all you really have to remember, only two of them are liquids. All you really have to remember is the ones that are gases. Okay, so as we mentioned previously, the metalloids or semimetals lie lie between the metals and the nonmetals, kind of on this diagonal. We call it the staircase line, because if you trace the right-hand edge of it, it looks like a staircase. So there it is there, and these guys have properties that are in between metals and nonmetals. All of them are solids at room temperature. So probably the classic semimetal or metalloid is silicon, Si, silicon. And it's obviously used in silicon chips in computers, so it's a good conductor. It's a really good conductor, but it's brittle, and it's also dull. It doesn't have that metallic luster at all. So it kind of has a little bit of the characteristics of the metals and a little bit of the characteristics of the non-metals, and that's typical for these metalloids. Okay, I talked about this idea of groups previously, and there are two systems of labeling the columns or groups on a periodic table. One is where we use what we call Arabic numerals, which are just your everyday numerals. They were originally developed by by Arabic scholars. And then there is a system where we use Roman numerals. which was developed by Roman scholars. We tend to use this one more than the other one. And you see that when we use the Roman numerals, we also normally use a letter. There's a few examples where we don't in the middle of the periodic table here, but generally we use a letter, and that letter is either A or B. So the groups that are labeled 1A through 7A that I've highlighted there, they have a name that you should know. They're often referred to as the representative elements, or sometimes they're called the main group elements. Same thing, right? Main group elements and representative elements. They're your A group elements, 1A through 7A. Now, the groups with a B in their names, or alternatively the groups that don't have any letter in their name, they make up what we call the transition elements. These are the ones that are in the middle of the periodic table, right in here. So they're in the lower ones, right? Those guys there are your transition elements. Sometimes they're called transition metals, so because they are all metals. So you can call those transition metals if you don't want to call them transition elements. Either way, people will know what you're talking about. Now, there are two rows that you can see that sit underneath the periodic table, and they're called the inner transition elements, and they actually don't have a group number. They don't have a group number. And if you look here, you see that we can go from element 57 up to element 72. So where the hell is 58 through 71? Well, they're on that row there. So these guys are meant to go inside the transition elements. And then you see the same pattern here. This is 89, and then there's 90 through 103, and then we come back here and there's 104. So those guys are meant to go up there. So these guys that are underneath, in these two rows underneath here, are called the inner transition elements, and they're the only elements on the periodic table that don't have a group designation. They're called the inner transition elements because they're meant to go inside the transition elements. Why did we pull them out and put them at the bottom? Well, there are some what they call long forms of the periodic table which have them in their correct place, but they tend to be very long and skinny, so it works out better to put them underneath. It's really practical, save space. Okay, so that's what it's all about. Now, at the very far right of the periodic table, there's a group of elements that are all gases. They're all gases in here. They're in group 8A, and they're referred to as the noble gases because they're kind of like the nobles or the kings and queens. They don't really mix with the other elements except for under extraordinary conditions. Now, it wasn't until the 1960s that we discovered that these combine with any elements at all, when someone discovered that xenon will combine with fluorine under extraordinary circumstances. So we always thought that these were completely unreactive, and under most circumstances they are. So these guys are like the snobs of the periodic table, the elements in group 8A referred to as the noble gases. They're also known as the inert gases. So inert gases, I should put that term in here as well, inert gases. So that's another name for the elements that are in group 8A. Now, if you're a little sketchy on your Roman numerals, you might want to revise 1 through 8. Okay, that could be something that you might want to do just to make sure that you it takes like 30 seconds. You can do this, you've done it before. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the distribution of elements in the universe, and what we realize really quickly is the universe is very boring. Most of the 118 elements that we know of are present in tiny, tiny, tiny little amounts in our universe. So what we know is that we find 88 of the elements, 88 out of the 118 elements, naturally. We can find them in, by looking at it, examining our universe. There they are, they exist. 30 of the elements have been only made in the laboratory. We've never observed them in nature. We make these in big particle accelerators. Okay. Those 30 that we've produced in the lab are all radioactive, and they only exist for very short periods of time. So that's why we don't see them in natural samples, right? They just kind of disappear after a little while. So they're barely stable. They convert into other elements quite quickly. That is, of course, a violation of Dalton's postulates, isn't it? Okay, so this is what I was mentioning before. Most of the matter in the universe is really, really boring. Most of the matter in the universe is hydrogen with a tiny little bit of helium. So the universe is about 99.9% a mixture of hydrogen and helium, only two types of atoms. And then of that 99.9%, greater than 90% of that is hydrogen. So, like I said, the universe is really, really boring. Now, you might be wondering how we know this. How do we know what is out there in the universe? I mean, until recently, no one had been further than the surface of the Earth. And then, a couple of hundred years ago, we started doing balloon flights. And then eventually we, in 1969, we got ourselves to the moon. We've sent a couple of space probes to other places in our solar system. So how the heck do we know what the universe is made of? Well, you have to think about what can we get from space? And some people have said, well, we can get meteorites, but that's a pretty kind of like limited sample. Not many meteorites hit the Earth that we can analyze, and maybe they would get contaminated on the way here. But what we can do though is we can look at the light that comes from stars and other objects in our universe, and it turns out that when matter is energized, the different elements glow with different characteristic colors. So, for example, you're probably aware that neon glows. If you've ever heard of neon lights, it glows with a characteristic pink color. Sodium glows with a characteristic yellow color. So if you see yellow traffic lights, yellow street lamps, they have a little bit of sodium in them. Mercury, when it's energized, glows white, and so that's why you can't just dump fluorescent white fluorescent tubes into regular garbage. You have to dispose of them correctly, because mercury is highly toxic. And then, so what color do we see when we look at the stars? Well, it kind of looks like our sun, a sort of an orangey color, and you guessed it, that's characteristic of hydrogen. So by looking at the light that comes from objects out in our universe, we can figure out what stuff is made from. Now, the universe as a whole is very different from sort of like localized samples of matter like the Earth or us. So, for example, about 80% of the matter in the Earth's crust, atmosphere, and water is oxygen and silicon. So, in the space where we live, there's only really two elements present, oxygen and silicon, and then there's sort of like what we call trace amounts of other things. So, where humans live, about 80+% of the Earth is mostly silicon and oxygen. Silicon dioxide is quartz, commonly found in sand and soil. So it's not that surprising, right? Now, if you look at, our bodies themselves, you find a different distribution of the elements, right? So this is the elemental composition of a human body. Somebody put a human body in a blender and analyzed what elements were present, which is kind of terrifying. And they did this relatively recently. So that's sort of interesting. And what you realize is that more than 90% of a human is made up of only three elements. And those three elements, oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen. So carbon is found in all of our muscles, it's in our proteins, it's in our DNA. All of the cellular material of our bodies is carbon-based, and then we also have a bunch of water present, which accounts for the hydrogen and the oxygen. So you can see that. Nitrogen is also an important element because our proteins are made of amino acids, and all amino acids contain nitrogen. Okay, so that kind of gives you an overview of the composition of our universe, our planet, and us. And you can see that, elements kind of like aggregate in different sort of ratios and amounts depending on, what that system is looking to achieve, right? So obviously the human body is, trying to maintain life, and that requires a different ratio of elements than what the Earth requires to maintain its shape. Okay, so hopefully you now understand sort of a little bit about the elements, and we've introduced the concept of the periodic table. I just want to say one thing more about the periodic table. Sometimes you want to sketch out the periodic table. It has this kind of general shape where it's kind of got these like higher parts on the end. There are 2 columns on the left, and then there are 6 columns. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We need to get an extra one in there. 6 columns on the right. In the middle, there are, you might not know this, but there are 10 columns. I won't draw them all in. But that's the general shape of your periodic table. The taller regions of the periodic table, they're your representative or main group elements. And they're the ones that we're going to be really concerned with. That's what we're going to be spending most of our time talking about. Everything else, we've got inner transition, and then we've got transition elements up there. So we've got the kind of general feel for what the periodic table looks like.